Okay, so we've talked about creating documents and reading documents. Now let's take a look at updating documents. And if you remember, there are some situations in which updates can actually end up creating documents, as I mentioned earlier. MongoDB provides 3 different update commands. We'll look at each in turn. They are update one, update many, and replace one. We'll look at each in turn. So first, let's go to the shell. And what I want to demonstrate is update one. Now, before we do that, let's remind ourselves what kind of documents we're dealing with here. So again, working through my movie details dataset, I'm going to do a find for The Martian. And let's pretty that up. So you can see here that this particular movie is not currently listing any awards, nor is there a poster. So a lot of these movies, let's take a look at something else, contain a field called poster that links you to the movie poster for this particular movie. Now, The Martian doesn't contain a poster, nor does it contain awards. I'm going to use this as an example to demonstrate the use of the update one command. In many applications, you're going to have situations in which you need to update existing data. This is true in MongoDB applications, as well as in applications backed by relational databases. In MongoDB, this is a straightforward process in most cases, because all we have to do is add a field. In a relational database, you'd have to do an alter table command or something like that. Here, we can just drop in a poster field, even if there are no other documents in the collection that contain that field. There are, of course, but the flexibility is there if we need it. So now what we're going to do is call the update one command on the movie details collection. And let's talk just briefly about the syntax. So the basic idea here with all 3 of the update commands is that you first specify a filter document or selector document. As with find, this will identify the document or documents that we want to update. Now, the way update one works is it will simply update the first document matching our selector. So if, for example, we had put in something here like tomato.meter 100, there'd end up being a number of documents that match that. The first one retrieved by the database would be the one that ends up getting updated. In this case, there is just one movie that is titled The Martian. Now, of course, in an application, we'd be using a unique identifier such as the _ID in order to distinguish which document it is that we'd like to add a poster to. I'm doing it this way just so it's immediately obvious exactly what movie we're talking about. The second argument to update one is where we specify how we would like to update the document. You must apply an update operator of some kind, and we'll take a look at other update operators. In this case, we're using the $set operator. Now, this operator takes a document as an argument, and it's expecting a document that has a number of fields specified. What it will do is update the document matching this filter such that all key value pairs are reflected in the new version of the document that's created. So in this case, what's going to happen is that we're going to add a poster field and supply this URL as the value for that field. If there was an existing poster field, this would modify its value to the URL specified here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. The response we get back is useful in that it tells us that the update was acknowledged by the database. We ended up matching just one document. If we had matched more, we'd get that count here. And then we're told how many we modified. Now for update one, it should always be 1 or 0. In this case, we did end up modifying our The Martian movie document. Let's take a look at that document now to see what it looks like. And you can see that sure enough, we did in fact add the poster field to this particular document. Update operators, as you might imagine, aren't limited to scalar updates like this. We can update fields with any legal value. As a quick example, let's go ahead and supply the awards field for The Martian. Remember that it was missing awards from its document. So let's take a quick look at an example. In this case, we're going to update the awards for this document because, as we noticed earlier, they're currently missing from this document. If we query again for The Martian, we see that in fact the awards field has been added with the value of this nested document that we supplied. So that's a nice initial introduction to update one. What I'd like to do now is give you a sense for the different types of field update operators that we have available to us. We used set. This completely replaces or adds each field specified in its parameter, as we saw here and in the earlier find one that we did, with whatever value we supply. There's also an unset operator, and this will completely remove the field that we specify from the document. Others here include min and max. This allows us to update a field based on comparison with another value, taking the min of the 2 values or the max of the 2 values. And as we scroll through here, we can see there are a number of other operators. I'll leave it as an exercise to you to investigate what other operators are available. They're all fairly self-explanatory, and there's good documentation on each one of them. So let's take a look at a couple more of these operators as we continue moving through our examples here. Updates have several different use cases. They're used to correct errors and, over time, keep our data current. For movie data, much of what's there is static. So we've got directors, authors, titles, etc. Other content, such as reviews and ratings, will need to be updated as users take action, creating new reviews or ratings. We could use set to make these kinds of updates, but that's an error-prone approach. It's too easy to do the arithmetic incorrectly or make other types of errors. Instead, we have a number of operators that support numeric updates of data. So, as I mentioned, we've got min and max. There's inc to increment. There's an increment operator, and there's a multiplication operator. Let's look at an example of using increment operator to update reviews. So here what we're going to do is, again, working with the Martian, we're going to increment the tomato reviews count by 3 and the tomato user reviews by 25. So this value and this value will be modified. Looks like it was a success. Let's take a look at the document again. Okay, and we can see that, in fact, we did add 3 to reviews and 25 to user reviews. Now, as you might imagine, there are a number of situations in which we want to update array values. MongoDB provides a number of update operators for arrays. In addition to those, it provides for scalar fields. So for array fields, I can treat them as a set and update them with new values only if the value isn't already contained in the array. I can pull off the first or last item of array, depending on my parameters to the pop operator. I can remove all values that match some criteria, and of course I can push on new values. So again, I encourage you to take a look at the documentation for array update operators. Familiarize yourself with their functionality by working through a few exercises. Let's take a look at a couple of examples in which we're going to need to update array fields. Now for this, I'd like to take a look at another collection that I don't believe we've seen yet, that being a reviews collection. This is simply a collection of reviews for movies in our dataset. For most web applications, we have a desire to structure our data in such a way that we can get all the data we need to render an individual page with as few database queries as possible. For data like movies, most applications will want to display reviews on the page, together with data such as we're seeing here. What we recommend in a lot of situations like that is that we actually embed some fraction of the reviews for a movie, a product, etc. in documents together with the rest of the data that will need to be rendered on the page. So the type of scenario we're going to set up is one in which we'll maintain, say, the 5 most recent reviews for each movie, and go ahead and render those on the page. And then if people want to see the rest of the reviews, then we can do a separate page load that will require a query to the reviews collection to pull in the rest of the reviews. So we'll keep the most recent reviews together with the data for the page view for a movie. And again, this is in a hypothetical application. We're not actually going to build that here in this lesson. I'm just trying to set an appropriate context for some of the things that we're talking about here. So what we might do for reviews is something like the following. Let's take a look at the effect on our document. And we can see that what we've done is actually added a new field. It's an array field, and it contains 1 review at this point. Okay, now let's take a look at the command that we used to do this. Okay, so let's see if we can get a better view on this command. Here we go. I'll just copy it in here. So what we're doing here, again, filtering on the Martian. Then what we're doing is using the push operator. Now, prior to executing this update, this movie did not contain any reviews. But following with the general pattern in the MongoDB query language, even though the field doesn't already exist, if we try to add something to it, MongoDB will simply create the field. So in this case, the result is that we'll end up creating a reviews field. That reviews field will be an array field, and we'll push on this review document as the first element of that array. Now, over time, we'll end up adding additional reviews to this document. Here, I just added several others. Let's take a look. And we can see now that our movie, The Martian, contains a number of different reviews. Okay, so let's take a look again at the command that we used to do this. And I'll just drop in a piece of the command here. So again, we're using push And as expected, we're pushing on to the reviews field, but we're adding this $each modifier. Some of our update operators, particularly those having to do with arrays, have modifiers associated with them. This modifier says that we should push on each one of these documents as an individual element of the reviews array. If we don't use $each, then what happens, and you can see where we would need both types of functionality, but if we don't use $each, then what happens is the entire array that we specify in our call to push will be added as a single element in the array. So we would have an array that then had a single element that was itself an array. That's not what we want here. We want a nice flat array containing all of our reviews. While we're on the subject of modifiers, let's talk about one more that's going to be important. I mentioned that we just want to keep 5 reviews in our document details. Now, one way we could do that is every time we get a new review, delete the oldest one of the 5 from the document and add the new one. This type of behavior is common enough that we actually support this directly in MongoDB. The slice modifier for push has to be used with $each. What it says is, go ahead and push on everything that's listed here in the value for $each, but keep just 5 of the elements in the array. Now, depending on whether there's a positive or negative value here, we're either keeping the last 5 or the first 5. I want to keep the first 5 because I'm adding reviews as they come in and want the 5 most recent. So let's go ahead and execute this query, okay? And we can see that we had success. Let's take a look at our doc. And what's interesting here is that nowhere to be found is that update that I just made. I forgot to do something pretty important. If I want to ensure that the value I'm pushing on goes on the front of the array, I need to use the position modifier for push. Now you can see that the review I just added is the very first one listed, and what we've got here are our 5 most recent reviews, and only 5 reviews. The rest that were there are eliminated as part of our push operation here. Now, for a complete solution to this, I would also need to make sure that when a review comes in, I am adding it appropriately to our reviews collection and creating a reference between each review in the reviews collection and the document to which they refer. So that's update 1. We've looked at updates for scalar values and for array values. And we've actually seen an example of updating a field that contains a nested document. We've been using the update 1 command. All of these same principles apply to update many. The difference being that update many will make the same modification to all documents that match our filter. So let's take a look at a couple of examples for update many. So what I'd like to take a look at is a little bit of a data cleaning example. Now, I happen to know that in this data set, there are some fields in some documents that are set to null. What I'd like to do, because this is more the convention for MongoDB, is for any fields that are null, I'm actually going to eliminate them from the document. And you can see that in this particular document, not only is rated null, but so is the poster field. And just to give you an idea for why update many is handy here, I've actually got almost 1,600 documents in this collection for which rated is set to null. So what I'd like to do here then is update this collection, changing all of these values for rated. It turns out that there are actually some movies that are listed as unrated. And so what I could do is something like this. Using what we know so far about how to do updates, we could issue a command something like this. So in this case, again, update many, we're saying find all documents that have a value for rated that is null and set rated to unrated. In my opinion, this is the wrong way to go because unrated means something different than we simply don't know what the rating is, which is how I'm interpreting null. A better strategy, as I mentioned, to simply eliminate those fields for which rated is set to null. Now, I can do that using a command like this. In this case, I'm going to use the unset operator. And the unset operator will simply take all of the fields that I've listed in the document that I specify as $unset's value, and will remove them from all the matching docs. If I'm doing update 1, it will remove rated from one doc. Now, the value that I supply here doesn't really matter. I just tend to use an empty string. And we can see that I ended up modifying 1,599 documents. Okay, so this might be a little bit unexpected to you, but as it turns out, this is one way in which we can query for documents that don't actually have a rated field. If I actually run this query, you can see that nowhere in this document do we actually find a rated field, nor in any of the other documents that are retrieved. So now, only documents for which we actually know the rating, whether it's G, PG, R, or simply unrated, contain a rated field. Now, way back when we talked about creating documents using insert one and insert many, I mentioned that there was a third way to create documents in MongoDB, that being the upsert functionality of the MongoDB update commands. Now, upserts are operations for which, if no document is found matching our filter, we insert a new document, hence the term upsert. As I was creating the dataset for this lesson, I actually made use of the upsert functionality in MongoDB to create our movie details collection. So here's an example of how I built this collection. Now, I did this in a script, but I'll take a look at the same basic steps that I went through here in this example. So imagine that we have this detail object. Now, I just created this by assigning this variable detail to the object that represents this document in our collection. Now, in the script that I wrote, I essentially looped through data that I was bringing into the database, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't introduce any duplicate movie entries. So the way I dealt with that was by using a command that looks like this. Now, in the movie details collection, I called update1, and as my filter, I said, okay, what I want to do here is update any document that has the imdb.id value equal to the imdb ID value in my detail document. That is, the movie that I may need to actually insert into my database. The process that I used to grab the data that I wanted to put into our MongoDB collection was such that I couldn't guarantee only retrieving movies I hadn't seen before. So what I decided to do here then was use the set operator, and the net effect of this is essentially in updating the document, I'll replace it with essentially exactly the same detail information. What this guarantees is that I won't create a second document with all of the same detail information in it, but with a separate _ID value. And again, I didn't want to use the IMDb ID value as my _ID value for a couple of different reasons, which I won't go into. Now, the trick here is that I'm using this third parameter, upsert, setting it to true. And what this says is that if this filter doesn't match any documents in my collection, that means I haven't seen the document before. So I want to go ahead and insert it. The effect here then of this update is that for those situations, I will end up creating a new document in my collection to represent this detail data that I'm pulling in from another source. So the basic idea of upserts is that you want to make some type of update to a document in your collection, but if that document doesn't happen to be there already, you want to go ahead and create a new one using what would have been the net effect of the update operation. And of course, if we're creating a new document, it may be necessary for MongoDB to create an _ID field, which is what happened here. So now we've talked about update one, update many, and about upserts. The last thing I want to address in this lesson is our third update command, that being replace one. Now to look at this command, what I'd like to do is revisit our movies collection. Remember, this is the collection that contains the summary data about movies. And we'll just pretty that up. Now, in our video database, we have this collection and we have the movie detail collection. In some cases, rather than have two separate collections, it might actually make sense to just have one. So imagine a scenario in which we had this data initially, and we want to replace that data with more detailed information on each of these movies. Now, what we could do in this situation is use the replace one command. Replace one, as with the update commands, takes a filter and does a wholesale document replacement. And you can probably see where I'm heading here. This is actually the strategy that I used for guaranteeing that I did not insert two duplicate documents in the movie details collection. It's a little bit difficult to see in that collection, though. So let's stick with this example that we have here as we work through this example. So remember that detail still contains the document information that I need, what I'm going to do here is replace the summary version of The Martian that I have with the detail version and do it in this movies collection. So before we run this command, let's take a look at our movies collection and do a find for The Martian. Okay, now let's take a look at what our detail document looks like, detail object to be more precise. And now let's go ahead and execute that replace one command. Okay, now doing a find for The Martian shows us that we've successfully replaced the document that was there before with this more detailed version. So that wraps up our discussion of updating documents in MongoDB. We looked at the update one, the update many, and the replace one commands, and we also looked at upserts.